Very good afternoon to everybody and welcome to this final plenary. We are delighted that you've chosen to join us and we hope that you'll have a fantastic time with us in this last session. My name's Elizabeth Walton. I'm a professor of education at the University of Nottingham and I'll be introducing my colleagues in a minute. So we think that we start in the wrong place if we think about inclusion as a series of interventions for individual students, which once we've implemented those interventions, we can go back to business as usual. We think that the starting place for inclusion is actually a critical interrogation of business as usual. We think we need to examine the exclusion and marginalization of young people and the way that this is inscribed and reinscribed in everyday practices and policies. First order questions, says Rogers Lee, are those that ask about the power relations that are articulated through the structures, processes, and cultures of schooling. And in other words, borrowing from Gramsci, who benefits from current arrangements? Asking and answering these questions are the first step in advancing inclusion and educational justice. But they also can't be the only steps. We have to find ways of doing things differently to ensure that we do not maintain these patterns of oppression. The exclusionary business as usual needs to be disrupted, and promising and hopeful alternatives need to be imagined and realized. So the following 5 presentations this afternoon each identify one or more axes of oppression or marginalization or exclusion in education that require addressing in our quest for more equitable and inclusive futures. The presenters are then going to each describe a project or an initiative that offer some promising practices and hopeful futures. And we're going to start with Professor Vinnie Lander. And we are particularly delighted to have her contribution in this panel, as Vinnie is the winner of the 2023 BERA Equality in Education Awards. Congratulations, Vinnie. Her work on race and racism and the development of an anti-racism framework for ITE offers hope for the development of race-cognizant and literate teachers. So, Vinnie, over to you.
Thank you for your introduction, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for coming today, and my thanks to BERA for the prize as well. I've only got 5 minutes. I'm going to time myself, so I'll put my watch on now. And hopefully I will stick to time. So I want to just pay tribute to my co-worker and collaborator, Professor Heather Smith, who we worked together to devise the anti-racism framework for initial teacher education and training. Next slide, please. This work was partly funded by Newcastle, Leeds Beckett, and the NEU, the National Educational Union. Why did we need to develop this framework? Well, I can take you through a brief rationale for why this work was necessary. First of all, our classrooms in England have linguistically and ethnically diverse youngsters. About a third of the pupil population come from what the DFE called Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. And approximately 20% of our students in school speak speak another language other than English in their homes. We have a catalogue and a litany of educational disparities going back to the 1960s and 1970s. One of those that is most prominent is the exclusion of Black and mixed race youngsters from our schools. And we know that the rate of permanent exclusions of Black and mixed background youngsters is higher than the national average. We know that racist incidents in schools are rising, and we know that there's a continued dehumanization of Black bodies in our schools, particularly when we think of the case of Child Q. But also in terms of policy, the initial teacher education landscape, unfortunately, doesn't prepare teachers to teach in multi-ethnic classrooms or in a multi-ethnic world in England. We have the core curriculum framework and the early career framework that provides no reference to race or cultural diversity, and one to linguistic diversity. So, as Heather wrote, there's a general tendency towards deracialisation in statutory and guidance policy documents relating to education and associated regulatory inspection frameworks, and in the literal removal of reference to race and ipso facto a concern for racism. So just by that present absence, as Michael Apple calls it, we're indicating that race or even racism are not important in our schools. And then we have the predominantly white workforce, a workforce that has been predominantly white for decades. Yet we know from the NFER report in May 2022 that people from Asian and Black minority ethnic backgrounds are keen to come into teaching. However, if you look at their report, you'll see that the trajectory for Black, Asian and minority ethnic candidates that come into initial teacher education make their way through the profession, and as they make their way through the profession, aspiring for headship and senior leadership, the numbers decrease at quite a steep pace, whereas alternatively, the curve and the graph goes up for white candidates. So something is happening in our schools. So it was this rationale that really underpinned our research. And our thanks to USET and NASBIT for actually helping us to promote this research, but also to our partners, NALDIC, Show Racism the Red Card, the NEU, Universities of Sanctuary, and the BayMed Network. What did we actually do? Well, first of all, we conducted a global literature review. And in that literature review, we looked at topics such as words such as anti-racism, initial teacher education. And what we found were, and this was a global literature review, that there were only 123 papers that covered the intersection of anti-racist education, particularly in teacher education. What did it show us? That the one state that avoided referencing to racism, all the literature showed that that state was the UK. Other states like the US, Australia, New Zealand mentioned aspects of race and racism. The literature showed us there was a need to embed anti-racism in initial teacher education, and that where there was practice, it tended to rely on one or two tutors, that there was a lack of confidence amongst tutors to teach this particular topic, and that there needed to be anti-racist training for teacher educators in our universities and in our schools. So there's been this exclusion of race and minimal coverage as if it's not important in preparing future teachers, and I could say more, but I won't. That global literature review then informed our national survey that went out to all providers. I haven't got time to talk about that in detail, but what was clear was the people that did respond, and we didn't have very many respondents. Probably if you think there are 120 universities that conduct initial teacher education in England, we had about 25 responses. But everyone said there was a need for it. Those that responded, the majority said that there was little time for it, and that we needed to do something about it. Those were the key messages. From the survey, from the literature review, we actually devised the anti-racism framework. And just very quickly to say that use the QR code to find out a little bit more about it. We devised it so that it had overarching values. There's the global literature review that you can access. You can also access the survey findings. But quite importantly, in the back half of the document, there are themes to help ask key questions of providers, themes around pedagogy and curriculum, student-teacher placements, leadership in teacher education, and for training for staff, not just in universities, but in our schools, and course evaluations. And I could say more later on.
Thanks, Vinny. We really appreciate the emphasis you've placed there, Vinny, on the need for the recognition of the impact of racism, and with it the need for a sense of affirming our shared humanity. Dr. Deborah Sabrick builds on some of these ideas as she turns our focus towards historical narratives and the history curriculum, and the misrepresentation, marginalization, or exclusion of some groups. Debbie's going to suggest how school history can be inclusive of silenced voices and how their contributions to the narratives can be embraced. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I posed a number of questions to frame my discussion this morning. So, what is history for? Who is history for? And where do I find me in this history that I'm learning? Now, history and history curricula often are seen as contentious questions or challenging questions, and I don't intend to answer the who or what or how we should teach today because I've only have 5 minutes. So I'm going to take a very tiny look at this. So if we think about school history, the compulsory history that we learn in primary or secondary education, it is often developed to tell a narrative of who we are as a nation or as a community of people. And frequently, the narrative can be taught as a single narrative of truths, one that many children accept without question. So we tend to teach, especially in compulsory education, history as a sort of continuum beginning from X time, say the Romans, say the Greeks, and Y time, let's say modern periods. And again, it's a single narrative that is meant to give a sort of overview of history. Now, when we look at that, we know that actually history is quite complex, and that there are many intersecting narratives in that overarching narrative that we are taught. And those narratives need to be unpicked, they need to be analyzed, and they need to be questioned. And children need the skills in order to do that. So they need to be critical thinkers, they need to be questioners, they need to ask, where am I in this history? Especially if they don't see themselves in those history textbooks that we all know and love as teachers. So when we look at school history, we often look at the great and the good. And those narratives can lack depth, or they can perhaps, in more kinder terms, only tell one side of the story. So I have 3 pictures there, okay? If we start with the solo picture, okay, that is Garrett Morgan. How many of you have heard of Garrett Morgan? One person, okay? Now, Garrett Morgan is a person who probably impacts your life on a daily basis, but you don't know that. So if you have walked across the street and you have used a traffic light today, or you have driven and you have used a traffic light, he's the guy, okay? But he was never part of the discussion of inventors and inventions in the Industrial Revolution or the post-industrial revolution. How many of you know who Thomas Edison is? How many of you know there's a slightly contentious story around Edison? Yeah, okay. So Garrett Morgan never made it into the history books, but Edison and the less contentious side of Edison did make it in. If we look at the duo, does anybody know who the duo is? Nope. Vinny knows. Crick and Watson. Okay, how many of you have heard of Crick and Watson? How many of you have heard of DNA? How many of you know what the DNA sequencing model looks like, the double helix? Brilliant. They didn't invent it, they discovered it, but it was Odile Crick who actually pictured it for us. And in reality, there were several women scientists, one of whom was Rosalind Franklin, who were actually integral to their research. She's only gotten her blue plaque in the last 2 months. They've had their blue plaque next to the Eagle Pub for quite some time. If you look at the trio of women there, how many of you recognize them? Slightly more. How many of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures? Okay. How many of you know Neil Armstrong and the space race? Yeah. You know about the men. You don't necessarily know about the women behind them. Now, my watch is going off, and Elizabeth is going to be very cranky with me in a minute. I think what I'm trying to say here is that effectively, okay, we often do not have other people. We picture history in one way. And if you're a child of color, if you're a child with a disability, and you don't see yourselves in that story, or you don't hear about your communities in that story, that's hugely problematic for you. And where you fit in that community also becomes hugely problematic. So I'll say 3 last words. We'll talk about decolonization, and we can talk about the pedagogies around decolonization, and we can talk about teacher education to make sure that this does not continue in another generation. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Sally.
Thanks, Debbie. Yes, so it's Professor Sally Elton-Chalcraft who identifies the contribution that stringent testing regimes and hegemonic forms of success make to disadvantage. She's going to present some work that seeks to support young people to escape boredom, loneliness, pressure at home and at school by making things, by making friends, and by making a difference in the community. She also introduces the Funometer scale, which seeks to inject fun into learning.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, as Elizabeth has said, our plenary is approaching the concept of inclusion in terms of promising practices and hopeful futures. And one of the ideas I'm going to talk about is the Funometer scale. It sounds very grand, but it's actually taken from Dr. Seuss's book, The Cat in the Hat, the film of it. I'm a primary school teacher at heart still. So, can you just think for a moment, when was the last time you had fun or felt intellectually stimulated in your day job as an educator? Hopefully during this conference. But most of the young people and children that I know thrive in conditions which are inclusive. And as educators, we strive to dismantle disadvantage, promote social justice and inclusion. And as Vinny and Debbie have already said, and various others of you have discussed at this conference, and particularly in my own special interest group, the Religions, Values and Education SIG, the inclusive practice is really important. So the Funometer scale. My colleagues and I at the University of Cumbria developed the Funometer scale to capture what participants described as one of the conditions for effective and creative teaching and learning. A sample of children aged 9 and 10 and their teachers and our University of Cumbria student teachers provided us with examples of activities which were perceived to be challenging, fun, exciting, or boring, or sterile, and either too easy or too difficult, or discriminatory. And if you'd like to read more, the references there, Elton-Chalcraft and Mills. So this Funometer scale we're drawing on as we currently evaluate a local charities work, E2M, Escape to Make. And in brief, this arts-based Northwest charity provides sessions which are an antidote to the stringent testing regimes and hegemonic forms of success prevalent today. There's not much fun going on, I don't think, in GCSEs and A-levels and SATs in the English context. As the mother of someone who's just taken A-levels, I can absolutely vouch for that. This raises the question, to what extent are these kind of exams dehumanizing? Are they sorting children, often in discriminatory ways, or do they celebrate achievement? So the charity E2M, Escape to Make, seeks to address the problems young people encounter. It provides safe spaces for young people to work with the volunteers and trained educationalists and youth workers. It's designed to support young people escape boredom, escape loneliness, escape pressures at home or school in order to make things like artifacts, art, meals, and so on, make friends, make a difference in the community. Many young people in our research said they had fun. And we're currently analysing evaluations from participants and leaders to unpack the impacts of the programme on the young people and leaders and the local community, and to understand what is meant by fun. Is it always positive? And fun isn't always positive. In a recent project, No Laughing Matter, which was a Harvard run project, so Harvard in the United States, in Justice in Schools, we explored the discriminatory effects of poking fun at deeply held religious beliefs. And we discussed a scenario about a teacher in a school where young people had drawn the offensive Charlie Hebdo affair cartoons. So negative joking is not what we would want to promote as fun. This isn't inclusive practice, obviously. But fun, humour, and enjoyment can be used as powerful strategies in the classroom. And I would argue that fun and creativity can be used to good effect. And this is captured in the second edition of Teaching RE Creatively, due in 2024. This is a collection of chapters by experienced RE teachers and educationalists, and it provides examples of creative and inclusive pedagogy for promising practices and hopeful futures. So like role play, visits, visitors, persona dolls, and things like that. Get the book. So having fun and enjoying intellectual stimulation can be a solitary endeavour, or it can be a collaborative activity. And sometimes it isn't fun. Children and adults can disagree. And there have been scholars who've talked about communities of disagreement. But in order to remain inclusive, there's a need to work at areas of disagreement where all feel valued and not discriminated against. And as I've just heard in a recent session, if you enjoy learning, it means you're finding it acceptable and therefore inclusive. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Well, Dr. Janet Hoskin is also concerned with young people who are misrecognized by the system. These are young people with complex health conditions who must negotiate living in the moment while also being aspirational about the future. So Janet reports on work that she's done with their mothers who are forced to challenge and disrupt notions of the normative while fighting for the rights of their children.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, yes, I'm just going to now talk about a small project that I've been doing with mothers of children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is a life-limiting complex health condition that causes muscle wasting. This kind of builds on work I've done with young people and schools around this area over the last 10 years, really. So the first thing I want you to have a look at, I don't know if you've come across muscular dystrophy before, but it's very much portrayed by the poster on the left-hand side, and you get the idea of the sort of narrative that is given for these children within school and within society. So it's very much a tragic model. We're supposed to feel sorry for them. As Tisdall talks about, that they're permanently under the professional gaze. So, children who have these complex health conditions, often the kind of professionals know best. They know, what you need to do with your life and the sorts of the sorts of targets and objectives and aspirations that you can have. And Sarah Ryan talks about this idea of a lack of an imagined future for these young people, because quite often expectations are very low, and I'm sure you've got experience of that, some of you in schools. And I've got at the bottom right-hand corner, not very good with my left and right, so I've just got a picture of the normative frequency distribution curve. And similarly to what Sally was saying, really this focus in schools on, the target, standards agenda. We're focusing often on the middle, on the bell curve of our children in the classes. Florian and Hart talk about the normative model of education and how we're often, teachers are taught to, I'm sure that's not the case with all our amazing teacher educators in this room, but quite often this idea that we're taught to support the middle of the classroom. We're not taught to work with the most complex children with the most complex health conditions. And really with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, this is what we're looking at. So the project then, so despite all this, I met the most amazing mothers who were doing the most amazing things. And I would say that what I found from this project was that they showed amazing strength, they had agency, and they showed disruption of these kind of narratives that you're facing on a day-to-day basis. So first of all, one of the things I'd want to say is that they really showed awareness of how they were expected to privilege other people's emotions rather than their own. So even though they were dealing with some very difficult and emotional things, they're watching their child degenerate in a muscle wasting condition, quite often they were told that when they talked to people or people asked them about their children, the person would say, oh, no, don't tell me, oh, I can't bear it, oh, is that really going to happen? And some of the quotes that the mothers learnt to deal with this emotional, and they learnt these amazing skills, what Catherine Runswick-Cole talks about this in her research with mothers with learning disabled children, that you learn to sort of grin and bear it, you're smiling through it. It's this idea of emotional baggage that women carry, and maybe you could argue that other women carry it as well, but particularly children who have disabled children are forced to perform in a certain way because they are privileging other people's emotions, really. But the fact that they were very aware of this was very interesting, I thought, that they were in this way disrupting this idea of how they're meant to feel. And another finding that I'll share was that they disrupted this idea that who the expert is. We're taught, what is Duchenne muscular dystrophy? What is autism? What is ADHD? We look in the diagnostic manuals. This is what it is. This is what we have to tell people. Well, who tells us that? Where do we get our knowledge from? We've talked this weekend a lot about epistemology. Whose knowledge is this? Where is the voice of the user, the expert, of the person who's living this with us intimately? And I heard stories from mothers who were, arguing with doctors. One mother in particular that stood out, who was challenging a doctor over her son's cardiac treatment. Doctor refused to give it to her son, and so she got in touch with somebody she'd heard speak at a conference, travelled 150 miles, had her son scanned, got treatment, and then he's now, on the best possible cardiology treatment that he needs to have a longer life. And yet that doctor whose her son was under is still quite cross with her, actually, so quite shocking. So again, we've got, mothers, families becoming the experts, disrupting that idea of who knows best. Not that I'm suggesting we don't need doctors, but I do think we have to think about, what the experience is of living with these things. And finally, I just wanted to talk about a theory that I find really helpful in these, looking at these conversations and looking at this disruption, looking at being human through a post-human lens, challenging this idea of, to be a human, you have to be male, you have to be white, you have to be non-disabled, you have to be Eurocentric. Actually, human beings, Ray Doty says that if you look at disability, it gives you a glimpse of what human beings could be, actually, because as a disabled young person, you are you are interdependent. You're dependent on other people. We need to be dependent on other people, but we have skills and strengths, as these mothers do, that they can share and that is needed in society, rather than a society and an education system that is just based on kind of the standards agenda, is just based on competition, and is just based on grades and scores. So I think I would recommend people have a look at Braidotti if they haven't. Dan Goodley uses it and talks about dishumanism and how we can really challenge the idea of being human.
Thanks, Janet. Our final presentation is by Dr. Amber Fensham-Smith, who draws on the growing field of alternative education, which offers rich examples of promising practices which seek to disrupt, broker, and extend what counts as good education, and for extending creative opportunities to elevate and co-produce collaborative research with children and young people who are experiencing these alternative education modalities. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. So, alternative education as a site of study and a site of practice has diversified, particularly over the last 10 years, not just in the UK, but internationally. What alternative education is extremely varied, and what it means to different groups is extremely varied. But at the core of many of these experiences, both the educators practicing in these different settings, who can sometimes be parents themselves, and for the learners, is really a struggle for legitimacy and representation across what counts as mainstream and, quote, normal modes or expected modes of education. What different modes of alternative provision often illustrate are incredible ways of achieving cultural and social practices for different groups. Some of these learners have found themselves in these settings through not necessarily choice. And what we need to do is to move towards understanding and recognizing these different forms of provision and understanding the transfer between alternative provisions and mainstream, and educators and learners sharing practices. So fundamentally, us as researchers and practitioners, we need to move towards techniques and methodologies that authentically represent silenced and excluded groups. And this necessitates reflective and authentic collaboration, which is extended to children and young people themselves. And there are many examples which I could highlight that intersect with youth and informal education as well as alternative provision. But one such example of this is the States of Mind organization, which is co-chaired by Dr. Paul Bagley. And it was launched in 2017 and has 620 student researchers who are part of the network. It has 12 partnership schools and has undertaken 21 research and knowledge exchange projects. In 2021, a group of researchers co-chaired with Dr. Paul Bagley produced a phenomenal report and documentary called Breaking the Silence. And this report sought to reimagine and re-envisage Ofsted's evaluation criteria and ask young people to challenge and question and reimagine a new criteria that did away with grades, which is increasingly a source for why we are seeing this narrowing of curriculum, pressure on teaching standards at the expense of some of the more interesting and diverse creative practices and phenomena, if I can't even say it, and fun in education. And what this lends me towards is that really a call for us to reflect on our role as knowledge brokers in the research process. What we need to be thinking about is how we are supporting, through our research inquiries and methodologies, co-production and participation of young people so that they can represent themselves and we also need to, this extends to our knowledge dissemination and how accessible these disseminations are and whether they actually feed into and impact the communities which we are representing in our making of knowledge. And that's, why Vinny's work is such a wonderful illustration of how praxis, research and praxis is blended to change and shape the knowledges of multiple stakeholders, including ultimately children and young people who are learning in these settings. So really, my final thoughts are, in addition to suggesting that you watch the Breaking Silence documentary, if you go to the States of Mind website, you can watch it. It's a wonderful artistic piece. Is that we need to think about hopeful futures and look at co-creation and reflective practice, but fundamental to all of these questions are fundamental to valuing and the recognition work that all of us have spoken about is the interrogation of our own positionalities, and as I mentioned, with us as the knowledge brokers, really investigating how we can extend spaces and opportunities to not only make knowledge with those who we are representing, but also to bridge and understand and change beyond the academy, which is central and really important. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amber. And thanks to all the contributors. And while each has had quite a different focus, together I think they leave us with 4 big ideas that we'd like to share with you that we think are good takeaways that would perhaps advance educational justice through inclusion. And these are our 4 takeaways. So the first one is the need for recognition work, as Amber has just mentioned. This is a real willingness to examine uncomfortable issues like privilege, like who benefits from the way we do things, how current systems are based around exclusion and exercised through ableism, racism, and other axes of oppression. We need to identify those hegemonic discourses, norms, practices like testing that entrench and thereby perpetuate educational exclusion. And the second thing is a need for humanizing work. This is about affirming our shared humanity, challenging those limited and diminishing notions of the human, and acting in ways that realize human rights, valuing different kinds of success, making room for fun, for creativity, for enjoyment, all of which are often neglected in education. And this humanizing work also includes acknowledging the entanglement of humans with other than humans and more than humans. And the need for co-produced research and knowledge generation. This is about finding creative ways of disrupting hierarchical and exploitative research relations, welcoming and making room for new, even disruptive voices, those who challenge the narratives and offer us fresh perspectives. This is about thinking about researchers as knowledge brokers, perhaps even bricoleurs in communities, among our participants, revisiting ethics, not just as an administrative process, but as a way of being. It's about authentic and reciprocal knowledge exchange rather than top-down notions of impact. And here we could think about the symbolic and material violence of some of the impact discourses on the communities who we do research on. And our final point before we're going to invite you to have some discussion is a need to live comfortably and to work comfortably with and within tensions, resisting those polarized positions that set up unhelpful binaries, that consign people to categories with rigid notions of what is correct or best. that we can hold the tensions between individual and group, high expectations and individual aspirations, assessment and inclusion, the human and the more than human, and perhaps framing these tensions as critical proximities rather than choices between opposing ideas. And in the last 10 minutes that we have together, we really didn't want to only hold the floor because we believe that there is so much in this room that could add to the conversation. And we're going to pose a number of questions that come out of what we've said. And we would like to invite you either individually or in pairs with the person sitting next to you, or in small groups. We can push the chairs around with the last session, so it doesn't matter. To talk about these questions, I'll pop them up. Select one or more that interests you. And there's a series of cards that we've handed out. We'd love it if you would jot down any points, any answers, any ideas that you have in response to those questions, because we're hoping to take this panel on into an edition of Research Intelligence, the BERA publication. And not only would we like your ideas as to input that, but in question, leading on from question 5, is, are you aware of any hopeful practices and promising futures that we should be thinking about, perhaps that we should be inviting into that publication? So please do use the cards to give us some feedback. There's a folder at the back for before you leave. So we're going to invite just 10 or more minutes for discussion among ourselves, and then I'll come back together and close off. So over to you. Right, we'd invite you to close off the conversations. So we've listened to some really rich discussions, which maybe they'll continue on after this. Please do add names and contact details if you would like to us to pick up on anything that you suggested on the cards. If you'd like to, if you've got an idea that might be a great addition to the Research Intelligence edition, if you'd like us to be in touch over anything in particular, please do that. Otherwise, you're welcome just to pop those cards in anonymously. That's also great. We're looking forward to reading through them. These are our contact details. If you'd like to be in contact with any or all or some of us. And again, I think we'd all really like to say thank you for staying. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Thank you for being willing to stay and talk with one another, and we appreciate the knowledge and the rich contributions in this room. And we remind you that there's a takeaway lunch to be had in the main tea area, and to wish you very safe travels and look forward to seeing you in Manchester next year. Bye, everyone.